it's distinctive in a lot of ways. A couple things really stand out, or a couple of aspects. One is that it's coming from the Pope, from the Vatican. The Vatican hasn't distinguished itself over the centuries in its wish to engage in mutual encounter. Historically, the Church has proposed rather than listened. It has spoken ex cathedra more than face to face and person to person. Of course, that's changed significantly since the Second Vatican Council, but this is a particularly um, powerful step forward because Francis, the Pope himself, is saying, let's go forth and encounter others and not presume to lead or to instruct, but simply to encounter. I guess related to that is the fact that, as far as I can tell, and I don't have significant personal experience with Pope Francis. I met him the way thousands of pilgrims have met him in St. Peter's Square for a minute or so.
Mhm.
But the culture of encounter seems something that is part of his person. It's we've seen it in his pontificate. We know it from his history as Father Bergoglio and as Archbishop and Cardinal Bergoglio, that this is a person who has sought to engage with others and deepen the life of faith through encounter with others. And so for him then to invite us and urge us to do the same has a particular authenticity because we recognize it as something that he knows well. Culture of encounter, as I'm approaching it, has to do with the encounter of people. And that's not necessarily one-to-one, but we're not talking about the encounter of 300 million Americans with 600 million people of Africa. It's at a much more personal scale than that. And the personal scale is really the key to my own engagement with the Catholic tradition and how it bears on the arts. Basically, to radically simplify the idea at the center of Christianity, the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ is just a recognition and an embrace of the human scale. God became a person. The personal scale, on some level, is the scale of the encounter with God that we're invited to have. We see that in the Gospels. The man Jesus, is encountering people, and their encounter with God comes in the form of a face-to-face encounter. 2 people, 3 people, a small group, some disciples on a boat, a small crowd that are hungry and have loaves and fishes multiplied for them. That's the scale of encounter as I understand it. And that may sound obvious and even self-evident, but it's not in our society. I mean, one of the biggest phenomena, or most important phenomena right now in our society, is the shaping of so much of culture by big data. Basically, the preferences or tastes or biographical details of millions of people are aggregated through the use of computers and used to work up a profile of who we supposedly are and how we supposedly will act. The idea being that we've acted in such a way in the past, or people like us have acted in such a way in the past, so that's the way we can be predicted to act in the future. But of course, we're free. We're not bound to behave the way people like us have behaved in the past. Fresh reality thrusts itself upon us, and we've got to deal with it. And we've got to make our individual choices for which we are personally responsible. So, with all that in mind, the culture of encounter and the personal scale that it suggests doesn't just have to do with art or the Gospels, and I'll get to art in a moment, but with a reminder that scale is the scale which enables us to hold our own and not capitulate, let's say, to invitations from the culture to see ourselves just as aggregate or as part of a group or as at the mercy of social trends. We are, each of us, an individual. We are a person. We are free to act. the choice matters, and it matters from moment to moment, and that's how we've got to live our lives. And then that's obvious in the realm of art, and we can talk about this in connection with the next question, but most of the literary art that I deal with has to do with encounters on the human scale. There's a few characters in the book, and the characters encounter one another, the reader encounters the characters, the reader encounters the author, and so forth. So it's the basis for what I think of as an aesthetic that's rooted in the Catholic tradition, but not exclusive to it, and that can be seen in the work of our time distinctively, but also naturally and without a lot of kind of a priori forcing of the idea on particular works of art. And it's with that assumption in mind that I've apply is too cold a word, but I've brought that outlook to all sorts of works of art over a couple of decades now. It has to do partly with my work as a journalist, and partly with my experience as a person, experience of sexual abuse at the hands of a member of the clergy. I've written about this most extensively in a long piece for The New Yorker. I think to assume the essential good intentions of the person with whom one is having an encounter, when we go back to Pope Francis' ideas of encounter, that's a baseline for it. You're meeting as rough and ready equals, and we can see in the sexual abuse crisis that the journalists who were asking pesky questions of cardinals were not regarded as equals. They were condescended to by people in charge. Healthy disagreement involves rough and ready encounter between people as equals who have an essential opting toward the trust in the good intentions of the other person, and the understanding, which is very hard in the short term, that the truth is beneficial to all. And in a fairly abstruse course on Thomas Aquinas that I took as an undergraduate at Fordham, one of the big points that I took away from it was Aquinas says we are made for truth as human beings. Truth is not something that we've constructed or that we discovered at a certain point in our development. We are oriented towards truth by our very nature. This is why lies are uncovered, why people who deceive often tip off their deceptions, not because they're just bad at it, but because we're fundamentally oriented towards truth. So if we go into an encounter with the idea that even if the truth is not the one that I initially think that I want to hear, my trust that the truth for its own sake is a good thing should enable me to both work with the other person and bear the provisional conflicts that go that are involved along the way. There's so much to say in response, and I'll just limit myself to the arts and specifically to literature just for purposes of economy. One of the things that's striking about Pope Francis's invitation for us to pursue a culture of encounter is that in significant ways, this is what our best selves do already. This is not a novel idea that he has copied in from some other planet. Encounter, most of us have grown up in societies that are significantly interreligious. Our own religious commitments, whether we recognize it or not, have been developed in a conscious or semi-conscious dialogue with the beliefs of others that are different. And that's now a rich experience that we have to draw on and to kind of fold back into the more formal and doctrinal experience of the church, experience that we already have. And for me, a lot of that experience is patterned by literary experience. In connection with my first book, The Life You Save May Be Your Own, I've thought about it as a pattern of pilgrimage in which we begin our lives in the middle of stories that are not ours, and then at certain points in our life, we wish to imitate or pattern our lives on the stories of others whom we've met or whom we've read about. And then that pattern, in some respects, becomes the pattern of our own lives. The life you save may be your own. And then it becomes a pattern for others to emulate in their lives. Then in literature, what happens is a literary text is a space of encounter. Basically, and this is amazing experience if you've had it, the writer writes his or her book more or less alone in a room. Yes, other people are involved, but compared to making a film or a play or playing in an orchestra, it's a solitary experience conducted in a small space. And that's true for the act of reading as well. Yes, there are reading groups and publishers and lectures and so forth, but substantially the reading experience is an individual person alone in a room. So that encounter between reader and writer is particularly intense because of the venturing out of solitude that it involves on the writer's part and then on the reader's part. It's as if the writer and reader kind of accompany the characters together on this journey in which reader and writer are encountering one another through their encounter with often fictional characters. I'm getting a little abstract at this point, but you can take from the tone of my voice how deeply I believe this to be the case. And I think it's a tremendously rich pattern that I hope to draw on in our work together in the culture of encounter and figure it out a little better than I understand it now. So Dorothy Day, for example, now she's up for canonization from the Vatican, and rightly so. That's a saint for our time if I've ever encountered one. But her life was shaped substantially by her reading of 19th century fiction, which had a religious or crypto-religious dimension, the work of Dickens and Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. She read those books and she wanted to live the kind of life that was described in those books, which isn't to say she just wanted to go to Russia or London. She wanted to live with the fullness of humanity, which had a supernatural aspect as she understood it from those books, and with a sense of what's at stake in a human life that was conveyed by Dostoevsky or by Tolstoy or by Dickens. And so she had already set out in some respects to do that when she encountered the Gospels, where the invitation to model her life on the stories told in a text is explicit. And so the buried pattern of the encounter she was already having was extruded or brought to the surface, and the rest is history.